I mean, aren't the two biggest denominations quite liberal, like the Presbyterian USA and the United Presbyterians? Are those the two biggest?
I believe they are, Bob, and I would have to say that the Presbyterian Church in the USA is gone apostate, and this occurred in the 1930s, and it's only gotten worse as time has gone on. I believe that they will be ordaining homosexuals within about 20 years, and they recently had a thing called the Reimagining Conference, where they were the sponsors, and it was basically a love fest with lesbians and goddess worship, and received a number of much negative press, and it led to several of the more conservative churches stopping their donations to the central organization.
You know, it's interesting that just today in the mail I received a newsletter from the American Family Association, and Donald Wildman is the publisher of that. And he mentions here that the United Methodist Church was at this conference that you just mentioned, the Reimagining Conference. And it says here in the middle of the article, included in discussions at the Fourth World Conference on Women held recently in Beijing and emerging in diversity issues in many areas is the notion that there are more than two genders, 5 to be exact. Depending on which radical feminist is preaching, the 5 reimagined genders are, in addition to male and female, hermaphrodites, merms or firms, pseudo-hermaphrodites. Other feminists teach that 5 genders are male, female, homosexual, bisexual, and transsexual. But anyways, so the United Presbyterians went to this. The United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian USA, you know, what has happened? I mean, these people all come from the Westminster, the tradition of the Westminster Confession, don't they?
Well, what's happened, Bob, is these churches are really secular humanism masquerading as Christianity. What they've done is they've rejected the doctrine of the infallibility of the Bible, and they've replaced it with secular humanism, or the idea that man can make his own law and man can make his own rule. And thus what they've done is they've redefined man any way they please, and they can basically make their own law.
Well, now, I wanted to start out the program tonight by talking about public schools. I talk a lot about public schools on this program, and I frequently say that I think public schools are public enemy number 1, and I also frequently say on this show that what we need is a separation of education and state. I personally would not want to see 1 penny of anybody's tax dollars going to support Michigan State University. Here we are in East Lansing, you know. Not 1 penny to the university system, and not 1 penny to grade schools, high schools, none of it. A total separation of education and state, a free market system of education. And, you know, I would hazard to say, Brian, that one of the reasons the liberals don't want that is because of the fact that in a very short period of time, due to the power of the tithe, you know, Christian culture would begin to dominate once again. You know, talk to me a little bit about property taxes, you know, whether they're biblical or not, and talk to me about, you know, Christian parents having their kids in public schools, and then public schools in general.
Well, let's just get one thing very clear from the beginning, that the greatest threat to our freedom is not Bill Clinton. The greatest threat to our freedom is not the federal government and not the FBI or the ATF or whatever you want to call it. The greatest threat right now is the fact that the government has control over your children. And the government in these statist schools has basically thrown God out of school and has a secular statist education for your children. Now what this means is that your children grow up, they reject God, they reject Jesus Christ, they believe in evolution, and they're brainwashed with all sorts of mysticism, secular humanism, and paganism in these schools. And the fact that they have control over your children is a much greater threat than what we hear about Ruby Ridge or the Branch Davidians. And those things are very serious. I don't want to play those things down. But secular humanism and the state controlling your children is a very, very serious problem. And property taxes, for example, it's a form of theft. because the state does not have the biblical right, the state does not have the God-given right to tax your property for statist education.
Now, what would you say to parents who have their children in the public schools? I had people that watch your show regularly know that I'm in sales and that I'm in different people's homes, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, 5, 6 days a week, and so I see a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different houses, and I was at some people's house just 2 nights ago. And, these people were, really nice people. I mean, their house was immaculate, good people. But, they've got their kids, in these public schools. And there's a lot of Christian parents that have their kids in the public schools. And the reason they do is because I was talking about it with these people, and they were saying, well, if you have 2 kids, you're gonna, if you're gonna pay for daycare, that's gonna be $175 a week, just, probably for 2 kids, roughly, $80 a kid for 40 hours, $2 an hour. You're up to, somewhere around $175, when you figure in a little overtime, they're driving to and from work or to and from picking up the kids. And, then you've got the extra car, the extra auto insurance, all these kinds of things. Do you have a message for Christian parents who still have their kids in the public schools?
Well, you have to keep in mind that the most important thing in the education of your child is the fact that Jesus Christ is central in teaching. And most Christians, unfortunately, in this country have accepted what I call the myth of neutrality. The myth that one can separate education from Jesus Christ or separate any area of life from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ has authority over the civil government. Jesus Christ has authority over your children. And if you try to separate what Jesus Christ and what he says and what he teaches in the Bible from education in any way, you're basically perverting the minds of your children.
Now, before the program tonight, I mentioned to you that I had a discussion with another pastor, and he has a program on public access here. His name's Paget Maynard. And I was telling this pastor that, that I didn't think property taxes were biblical, and that I didn't think that, furthermore, that I didn't think the graduated income tax was biblical. Why don't you just talk a little bit about, what biblical taxation would look like, and expand a little bit more on why property taxes, are, in a word, antichrist.
Well, we have to take into consideration that the Bible teaches very clearly that anything beyond a 10% tax by the state is considered tyranny. And the Bible definitely teaches a flat tax, not going beyond 10%. Okay, the church, the tithe of the church is 10%. Okay, and that takes first priority. The church is more important in a sense than the civil government. They're both important in their separate spheres. But anything beyond 10% is tyranny, and the Bible teaches a flat tax. The idea that if you're prosperous and you make more money than someone else and the state can confiscate your money, which is a form of theft, and give it to the poor, that's theft. That's called stealing, and it's forbidden in the Bible.
Yeah, plus it just doesn't work, does it, Brian?
It's an absolute failure, and welfare is one of the worst things that has been done to poor families in this country, because it takes away responsibility and basically the need to work, and it's just basically a terrible situation.
Okay, now let me talk to my viewers. My friends, if you're sitting at home and you're watching the show, you watch it regularly. I know there's a lot of you out there by the phone calls that I get and running into you in public. I know a lot of you don't go to church. I know a lot of you have been disappointed with, shall we say, the lukewarm preaching that you found, the cowardly preaching. The preaching from the pulpits, which is almost a Robert Schuller make-me-feel-good type of preaching. You see a lot of that, around the country and in this town. If you're getting a little bit excited about, Brian's approach to the gospel, Brian's approach to scriptures, if you're getting a little bit excited about a man of God who doesn't compromise, my friends, you need to think about maybe attending this new church in Lansing, this Reformed Presbyterian church, with, as he said, a heritage that goes back hundreds of years. And Brian, we've got a phone call. When after the call, let's try to remember to talk a little bit about the Westminster Confession, and what it is with these churches that have totally lost touch with what am I trying to say here? The traditional heritage of the Protestant churches in general. But let's go to the caller. Caller, good evening. You're on the air with Bob and Brian.
Well, I go to one of these worthless government schools, and, it's amazing how much they hate God. And, I talk to some people who don't believe that these government schools teach secular humanism, and they just don't know what they're talking about. They haven't been there.
Hang on for just a second. What would you say are some, when you say secular humanism, a lot of people at home may not know what are some of the basic tenets of secular humanism. What are some of the things they believe?
Well, secular humanism, you have to understand that prior to the 20th century, for most of Western civilization, has been dominated by what we call the Christian worldview. Now, I'm not saying that everyone was a Christian, but I'm saying that everyone functioned within a Christian worldview framework. After the turn of the century, from 1870 to about the 1930s, what we call secular humanism, it's also called materialistic naturalism, came to dominate the large denominations. It came to dominate our universities. It came to dominate eventually the public schools. And it came to dominate our civil government and the secular media. Now, secular humanism basically says that man is the measure of all things, that man can solve problems without God, and that man is his own God and declares his own law. And we've seen the seeds and the results of secular humanism is basically a generation after the fall of the Christian worldview in the 1960s. That second generation, who was raised on secular humanism, now are reaping the fruits. The high crime rate, abortion, sexual immorality, the rise of the homosexual movement, the rise of radical feminism, all these things can be traced back to this rejection of God, the rejection of Jesus Christ in the Christian worldview, and the acceptance of basically a form of atheism, whether it's many people who profess to be Christians are really secular humanists with some Christian terminology thrown in.
Caller, you still there?
Yeah.
All right. Tell us a little bit more.
Well, I'm taking a government class right now, which is a requirement in the government schools. And we recently watched a movie that made our founding fathers look like drunk sex maniacs. Everybody in the colonial era, right before the Revolution and during the War for Independence, they make them all look like sex maniacs, drunks. All they want to do is drink beer and wine or whatever they had back then, hard liquor. They won't.
Okay, well, hang on just a second. Okay, what we're talking about here is the revision of history. I find it absolutely, utterly amazing and appalling that I have to debate with university students here whether or not America was founded, by Christians primarily with a Christian worldview, and not specifically the United States government, which there may be some area for debate there, but particularly the 13 colonies. You look at the requirements of a Trinitarian oath, not only to hold office, but just to be able to vote. And you look at the blasphemy laws throughout the colonies. This was a Christian nation. Now, liberals are engaged in a little bit of revisionism here, wouldn't you say, Brian?
Well, there's no question. You have to understand that there were what we call deists who were not Orthodox Christians in the civil government. Thomas Jefferson was one, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was known as a womanizer to an extent, and he did like to drink. But the vast majority of the founders of our country were Christians, and they were influenced somewhat by what we call right-wing Enlightenment thinking, Scottish common sense realism, and the predominant worldview that these men were working under, functioning under, was Christianity. Now, they were influenced, like I say, by right-wing Enlightenment thinking, and there is somewhat of a mixture, and the Constitution should be more explicitly Christian. It definitely has compromised in some of its